My name is Abby Preston. I am 32 years old, a public high school English teacher, and for 6 years I mortgaged my entire future to give my husband the one thing he demanded, a biological child. After endless rounds of injections, surgeries, and quiet blame, my husband walked out the door the very day a fertility specialist looked me in the eye and pronounced me permanently infertile. He said he could not waste his life on a broken woman. But 17 months later, I walked into his lavish beachside wedding. I did not come to object. I came carrying an 8-month-old baby boy, a stack of court-ordered DNA results, and a medical fraud indictment that would send his beautiful new bride pale with absolute terror. Before I tell you whose baby I was holding and exactly how I brought his fake empire crashing down around him, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy stories about the truth finally coming to light. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time it is there. I love connecting with you. Now let me take you back to the freezing room where the lie began. It was a Tuesday morning in November. I was sitting in the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned office of the most expensive private fertility clinic in the state. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, pale glow over everything in the room. The air smelled of strong hand sanitizer and cold clinical detachment. I was shivering, though, whether from the freezing temperature or the sheer exhaustion deep in my bones, I could not tell. I reached over and held Julian's hand. His fingers were stiff cold and entirely unyielding. For 6 brutal years, this clinic had been the center of our universe. When we first got married, Julian made it abundantly clear that a picture-perfect family was his ultimate goal. I wanted children too, but as the months turned into years with no success, his desire mutated into a dark obsession. And in our marriage, Julian's obsessions always became my heavy financial burdens. As a regional sales director, Julian made excellent money, but he insisted his income was strictly tied up in investments and maintaining the polished image he needed for corporate promotions. So the crushing weight of the fertility treatments fell entirely on my shoulders. I am a high school English teacher. My salary is modest to fund the endless cycles of in vitro fertilization, the daily hormone injections, the specialized ultrasounds, and the constant blood panels. I bled my own finances dry. I emptied my meager retirement account without a second thought. When that money vanished into the clinic's billing department, I did the unthinkable. I took out a massive second mortgage on the small paid-off childhood home my grandparents had left me. I poured every single cent I had into making Julian a father. I wore shoes with worn-out soles. I packed cheap sandwiches for lunch every single day, while Julian continued to buy tailored suits and lease luxury cars to project his success. I never complained. I believed we were a team fighting a shared heartbreaking battle. I thought the purple and yellow bruising on my stomach from the daily hormone shots was a badge of honor for our future family. The heavy oak door of the consultation room clicked open, snapping me out of my thoughts. Jessica walked in. She was the lead patient coordinator at the clinic, a 29-year-old woman with perfect blonde hair, designer scrubs, and an overly sympathetic smile that always felt a little too practiced. I had spoken to Jessica dozens of times over the past year. She coordinated my grueling schedules, handled my massive billing statements, and always offered me a comforting pat on the shoulder when yet another cycle failed. Today, her face was a rigid mask of somber professionalism. She did not even look at me. She walked straight to the doctor sitting across the wide mahogany desk from us and handed him a thick manila file. The raw data from my final, most aggressive round of testing. The doctor opened the file. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating. I squeezed Julian's hand, seeking reassurance, seeking the partnership I had paid so dearly for. He did not squeeze back. He was staring at the doctor with an intense, calculating look that I completely failed to understand at the time. The doctor sighed heavily, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses before finally meeting my eyes. His voice was entirely clinical, devoid of any real warmth or empathy. "Abby, I'm so sorry," he said. "We have run the hormone panels 3 separate times to be absolutely sure, but the data here is conclusive and undeniable. Your ovarian reserve has inexplicably dropped to 0. There are no viable eggs left. You are permanently infertile." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. Permanently infertile. 6 years of crushing debt, of intense physical pain, of holding on to fragile hope, all vanished in a single devastating sentence. I turned to Julian. The tears were already spilling hot down my cheeks. I was waiting for him to pull me into his arms. I was waiting for my husband to tell me that we would be okay, that we would find another way to build a family, that he loved me no matter what the medical chart said. Instead, Julian did the exact opposite. He dropped my hand. He did not pull away slowly or gently. He dropped my hand instantly, as if my skin had suddenly caught fire and burned him. He shifted his heavy leather chair backward, scraping it loudly against the floor, putting a solid foot of cold physical distance between us. The air in the room grew instantly colder. He looked at me not with grief, not with a husband's sympathy, but with absolute, undisguised disgust. In that single terrible movement, he set the tone for everything that was about to happen. I was no longer his beloved wife. I was a failed investment, a broken vessel that had cost him time. I just did not know yet that the entire investment had been rigged from the very start. The walk from the clinic to the parking lot felt like wading through freezing water. Julian walked 3 paces ahead of me, his shoes clicking sharply against the concrete. He did not hold the door or open the passenger side. He just clicked the unlock button and slid into the driver's seat of his leased sedan, a car my teacher's salary helped subsidize. I climbed in beside him, my body completely numb, my mind a blank slate of pure shock. The drive back to our quiet house took 45 minutes, and the silence inside the car was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet that pressed down on my chest. I stared out the window, watching the suburban streets blur past, desperately trying to process what the doctor had just confirmed. 0 ovarian reserve. My body had failed its biological purpose. All the grueling treatments, the thousands of dollars I had poured into the clinic, the second mortgage I had taken out on my childhood home. It was all for absolutely nothing. I kept glancing over at Julian, waiting for him to reach out. I needed him to place his hand over mine to tell me that we were still a team. But his jaw was locked tight. His eyes were fixed dead ahead. He looked like a ruthless corporate man who had just made a calculated business decision regarding a failing asset. When we pulled into our driveway, he turned off the engine, grabbed his briefcase, and walked inside without saying a single word. I stayed in the car for a few minutes, trying to gather enough physical strength to stand up. The bruising on my stomach from the daily hormone injections was throbbing, a cruel reminder of the battle I had just lost. When I finally walked through the front door, the house felt entirely different. It felt empty, as if the life had already been sucked right out of the rooms. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I walked slowly up the stairs to our master bedroom. The door was wide open, and there, sitting on top of our quilted bedspread, were 2 large leather suitcases. Julian was moving methodically between his closet and the bed, pulling expensive shirts from hangers and tossing them carelessly into the open luggage. He was clearing out his entire dresser. He was taking his heavy winter coats, his watches, his tailored suits. He was packing up his entire life right in front of me. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hands gripping the wooden frame so hard my knuckles turned white. "Julian," I whispered, my voice sounding small. "What are you doing?" He did not stop folding a gray cashmere sweater. He did not even look up at me. "I am leaving Abby," he said. His voice was perfectly level, utterly devoid of the compassionate man I had loved for almost a decade. I felt the floor drop out from beneath my feet. "Leaving. Today. We just got the worst news of our lives 2 hours ago. We need to sit down and talk about this." He finally stopped packing and turned to face me squarely. "There is nothing left to figure out," he said coldly. "I have been very clear since the day we met about what I want out of life. I want a real family. I want a legacy to leave behind. I have wasted 6 long years of my life waiting for you to give me that." I stared at him, paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of his words. Wasted. I had voluntarily drained my entire teacher retirement fund. I had leveraged the only piece of real estate I owned. I had subjected my body to years of invasive medical torture just to make him happy, and he was standing there telling me I had wasted his time. "You cannot just walk away like this." I pleaded, the tears finally spilling over my cheeks. "We made sacred vows, Julian. I am your wife." He zipped the first suitcase shut with a sharp, violent pull. "You were supposed to be my wife." He corrected his eyes, narrowing with undisguised disgust. "But look at you. You are completely empty inside. You are a broken woman, Abby, and I flatly refuse to spend the rest of my prime years anchored to a broken woman. I deserve a real family, and you are permanently incapable of giving me one." He grabbed the heavy handles of his luggage and pushed past me, his shoulder hitting mine hard enough to knock me off balance. I stumbled back against the hallway wall, unable to catch my breath. The man I had sacrificed my financial future and physical health for was confidently walking down the stairs, abandoning me on the exact day I needed him the most. I scrambled frantically after him, tripping over my own feet, crying and begging him to just stop and talk to me. He ignored me completely. He opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air without breaking his stride. I followed him out onto the porch, hugging my arms tightly across my chest. That is when I saw it. Parked at the end of our driveway, engine idling smoothly, was a silver luxury SUV. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to his mother, Barbara. She was sitting comfortably in the driver's seat, her window rolled down halfway. As Julian loaded his suitcases into the back of her vehicle, Barbara looked past her son staring directly at me, standing barefoot and weeping uncontrollably on the front porch. She did not look sympathetic. She did not look shocked. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, her cruel expression making it abundantly clear that this brutal exit had all been decided long before we ever set foot in that freezing clinic this morning. They had just been waiting for the official medical diagnosis to justify this departure. Julian slammed the trunk shut, climbed into the passenger seat, and without a single backward glance, they drove away down the street, leaving me completely shattered, financially ruined, and standing alone. The first 6 weeks after Julian walked out were a blur of numb routine and suffocating silence. I woke up every morning in a house that felt too empty. I went through the motions of my life like a ghost. I brewed coffee I could not drink. I drove to the high school and stood in front of my English classes pretending everything was normal. I graded papers until my eyes burned to keep my mind from circling back to that freezing clinic room. But the reality of my broken marriage crashed down on me on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had just gotten home when there was a sharp knock at the front door. It was a process server handing me a thick manila envelope. I took the envelope into the kitchen and sat at the wooden table. My hands trembled as I tore open the seal. I expected divorce papers, but I did not expect the sheer viciousness of Julian demands. I read through the legal jargon and felt the blood drain from my face. Julian was demanding that my childhood home be immediately put on the market and sold. His lawyer had drafted an entire section detailing the $60,000 spent on my failed fertility treatments. Julian legally classified those medical expenses as wasted marital investments. He claimed that because my body had failed to produce a child, he was entitled to full financial reimbursement from the equity of my house. The man I had loved for a decade wanted to leave me homeless to compensate for my biological failure. The cruelty of those printed words felt like a physical assault. I did not sleep that night. I paced the hardwood floors until the sun came up, a cold panic settling into my bones. By Monday morning, I was running on black coffee and adrenaline. I drove to the high school and walked into my classroom. The fluorescent lights overhead felt unusually bright. I stood at the front of the classroom trying to lead a discussion on American literature, but the words kept swimming on the pages. My head pounded with a strange rhythmic pressure. I turned to write an assignment on the whiteboard. I raised my hand holding the marker, but my arm felt like lead. A sudden, violent wave of dizziness washed over me. The classroom spun. The whiteboard tilted sideways. I heard a student call out my name in a panicked voice. I tried to answer, but the darkness closed in completely. I woke up staring at a ceiling made of white acoustic tiles. The smell of strong antiseptic filled my nose. I was lying in a hospital bed in the emergency room. An IV was taped to my hand, feeding fluids into my veins. A young nurse was checking a monitor next to my bed. She smiled warmly when she saw my eyes open and told me I had collapsed in my classroom. My principal had called an ambulance. She assured me I was safe and that the doctor would be in shortly to discuss my test results. I closed my eyes and let out a shaky breath. I assumed it was just exhaustion. I had barely eaten or slept since receiving those aggressive divorce papers. My body was shutting down from the overwhelming stress of losing my husband and potentially losing my home. 10 minutes later, the emergency room doctor walked in holding a digital tablet. He was a kind-looking man in his 50s with gentle eyes. He pulled up a stool and sat down next to my bed. He asked me how I was feeling, and I apologized for taking up a hospital bed just for dehydration. I told him I was going through a hostile divorce and the stress had finally caught up with me. The doctor looked at his tablet and then looked at me with a careful expression. He told me that dehydration was certainly a factor, but it was not the primary reason for my collapse. He said they had run a comprehensive blood panel when I arrived just to be safe. I braced myself expecting him to tell me I had developed a heart condition. Instead, the doctor leaned forward and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He told me my blood work showed exceptionally high levels of the pregnancy hormone. I stared at him blankly. I asked him what that meant. He offered a small, reassuring smile and said it meant I was pregnant. The room went perfectly silent. I heard the steady beep of the heart monitor next to my bed, but the sound seemed to come from 1,000 miles away. I shook my head instantly. I told him that was medically impossible. I explained that exactly 6 weeks ago, a highly specialized fertility doctor had looked me in the eye and diagnosed me with 0 ovarian reserve. I told him I was permanently infertile. The emergency room doctor frowned slightly. He tapped the screen of his tablet and verified my chart. He looked back at me and gently stated that regardless of what any clinic had told me 6 weeks ago, the blood tests run by this hospital were absolute. He told me I was not just pregnant. Based on the hormone concentration, I was exactly 8 weeks pregnant. I lay there paralyzed as the mathematical reality washed over my mind. 8 weeks. That meant I had conceived naturally, exactly 2 weeks before that devastating final appointment at the fertility clinic. 2 weeks before Jessica handed the doctor that file. 2 weeks before Julian dropped my hand and walked out the door, calling me a broken woman. The clinic had been wrong. The tests had been completely wrong. I was carrying a healthy, growing baby. A tiny spark of impossible joy flared in my chest, but it was immediately swallowed by a dark, horrifying realization. If I was pregnant, the medical file that declared me infertile was not just a mistake. It was a deliberate manipulation. And the man who had just demanded the sale of my childhood home to recoup his wasted investments was actually the father of the child he claimed I could never give him. I left the emergency room in a daze of absolute disbelief. I sat in the driver's seat of my sensible sedan for 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel. 8 weeks pregnant. The phrase echoed in my mind like a miracle. For 6 years, I had been told my body was fundamentally broken, and now, suddenly, I was carrying the very child Julian had demanded. A desperate, foolish wave of hope washed over me. I convinced myself this was the answer to our problems. If Julian knew I was pregnant, he would drop the divorce. He would cancel the demand to sell my childhood home. We could finally be the family we had sacrificed everything to build. I wiped my cheeks, started the engine, and drove straight to his corporate office park downtown. I wanted to catch him right at noon, when he usually took his lunch break. I pulled into the visitor lot, my heart hammering against my ribs. The campus was a massive complex of sleek glass and manicured green lawns, perfectly reflecting the polished image Julian cared so much about. I walked toward the main courtyard, where employees gathered near expensive coffee shops. I was rehearsing the exact words I would use. I wanted to tell him that the clinic had made a massive mistake, that our dreams were actually coming true. But those carefully rehearsed words died in my throat the second I saw him. Julian walked out of the heavy glass doors of the main lobby. He was wearing the tailored navy suit I had picked up from the dry cleaner just days before he walked out on me. He looked handsome, relaxed, and entirely unbothered that he was actively trying to ruin my life. But the true shock, the thing that made my feet stop moving entirely, was the person walking right beside him. He was not alone. His fingers were tightly intertwined with the hand of a young, striking blonde woman. She was laughing at something, he said, leaning into his shoulder with an easy, practiced intimacy that made my stomach violently churn. I blinked, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding in front of me. It was Jessica, the lead patient coordinator from the elite fertility clinic, the woman who had handed the doctor my supposedly devastating medical file, the woman who had offered a sympathetic pat on the back while I wept over my barren future. Here she was, 6 weeks later, holding the hand of my husband in the middle of a sunny corporate courtyard. The visual was so deeply wrong that my brain simply refused to process it. I stood frozen on the concrete path as they walked directly toward me. They were so absorbed in each other that they did not even notice me until I was standing less than 10 feet away. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. His relaxed smile vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid mask of sheer irritation. He dropped her hand, but he did not step away from her. Jessica looked at me with wide eyes, her face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. She recognized me immediately. Abby Julian snapped his voice sharp and loud enough to draw the attention of passing executives. "What on earth are you doing here? You cannot show up at my workplace." I ignored the embarrassment radiating from him. I ignored Jessica standing there in her expensive designer dress. I was operating on pure adrenaline and blind hope. "Julian, I need to tell you something." I blurted out, my voice trembling with raw emotion. "The hospital just ran blood tests. I collapsed at school this morning, but I am okay." "Julian, I am pregnant. I am 8 weeks pregnant." The clinic was wrong. I waited for the shock to register on his face. I waited for the miraculous realization to wash over him. Instead, the man I had loved for a decade looked at me and let out a harsh, cruel laugh. It was a cold, dismissive sound that echoed loudly across the courtyard. "You have got to be kidding me," he sneered, shaking his head in absolute disgust. "You are seriously trying to pull a stunt like this right now. You are pathetic, Abby. You are completely delusional." Before I could even attempt to defend myself against his cruel laughter, a third voice cut through the air. "Well, I see the desperate tactics have finally begun." I turned my head and saw Barbara, the mother of my husband, marching toward us from the direction of a high-end bistro across the courtyard. She was carrying a leather shopping bag, glaring at me with unbridled malice. She had been waiting to join them for a celebratory lunch. Barbara positioned herself directly between me and her son like a shield. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure revulsion. "You listen to me, you delusional, cheating tramp," Barbara announced, projecting her voice deliberately, so every single person in the vicinity could hear her vicious words. "You are not going to pin another man and his fake baby on my son to steal his assets in this divorce. We know exactly what you are trying to do, and it is absolutely sickening." I was so profoundly horrified that I could not form a single syllable. People were stopping to stare. Julian stepped forward. His eyes narrowed with cold fury. "If you ever show your face near my office or near Jessica ever again, I will file a restraining order against you by the end of the day." He threatened, his voice dripping with venom. "Now get out of here right now before I call security." He turned his back on me, took Jessica by the hand, and guided her toward the restaurant with Barbara trailing behind them like a smug bodyguard. I was left standing entirely alone in the middle of the courtyard, my face burning with public humiliation while the undeniable truth shattered my heart. The drive away from Julian's corporate office park was the longest journey of my life. I could barely see the road through my tears. The image of Barbara smirking and Julian holding Jessica's hand burned into my mind. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. For 6 years, I had been told my body was useless. Then an emergency room doctor told me I was pregnant. And now my own husband was calling me a delusional tramp, trying to trap him with another man's baby. A creeping paranoia took root in my mind. What if the emergency room made a mistake? What if Julian was right and I was just losing my sanity from the grief of the divorce? I needed to know the truth. I needed someone completely unconnected to Julian and that high-end fertility clinic to tell me what was actually happening inside my body. The next morning, I called a highly respected, independent obstetrician named Dr. David Mitchell. I begged the receptionist for an emergency cancellation slot, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in his waiting room. The atmosphere in Dr. Mitchell's office was completely different from the freezing, sterile environment I was used to. The walls were painted a warm, soft yellow, and soft instrumental music played through hidden speakers. I sat clutching a thick manila folder to my chest. It contained every medical record and diagnostic report I had legally requested and transferred from my old fertility clinic that morning. My leg bounced nervously. When a friendly nurse finally called my name, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. She led me into an exam room and took my vitals. I sat on the edge of the examination table, gripping the paper sheet beneath me so hard my fingers ached. 5 minutes later, Dr. Mitchell walked into the room. He was a tall man in his late 50s with kind eyes and a calm, reassuring voice. He introduced himself and sat down on a rolling stool. I handed him the thick folder of my fertility records and told him everything. I told him about the emergency room collapse, the pregnancy diagnosis, and the final fertility appointment where I was declared permanently infertile. Dr. Mitchell listened to my entire story without interrupting once. He just nodded slowly and told me that before we looked at the past, we needed to verify the present. He asked me to lie back so he could perform an ultrasound. I held my breath as he squeezed the cold gel onto my stomach. I stared at the ceiling, praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. Dr. Mitchell moved the wand carefully across my skin. His eyes were fixed intently on the monitor. And then, suddenly, a sound filled the small room. It was a rapid, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like a tiny, galloping horse. I turned my head to look at the screen. Right there in the center of the black and white static was a tiny, flickering shape. "That is your baby's heartbeat," Dr. Mitchell said with a warm smile. "You are absolutely pregnant, Abby, and based on the measurements, you are exactly 8 weeks and 3 days along. The baby is healthy and strong." I broke down sobbing. They were loud, ugly tears of pure relief. I was not crazy. I was not delusional. I was going to be a mother. Dr. Mitchell handed me a box of tissues and gave me a few minutes to compose myself. Once I had wiped my eyes and sat back up, he rolled his stool over to the small desk in the corner. He opened the thick manila folder I had brought from the fertility clinic. He wanted to review my medical history to understand how a misdiagnosis of that magnitude could have possibly occurred. I watched his face closely as he flipped through the pages of lab results and diagnostic charts. At first, his expression was simply focused and professional, but as he reached the final pages of the file, his brow furrowed. He stopped turning the pages. He leaned closer to the paper, tracing a line of data with his pen. He flipped back 2 pages, checked something else, and then returned to the final lab report. The silence in the room stretched out and grew heavy. Dr. Mitchell took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked up at me, and his kind expression had been replaced by one of deep medical concern. "Abby," he said slowly, choosing his words with extreme caution. "There is a glaring discrepancy in these records." I asked him what he meant, and my heart began to race. He turned the folder around and pushed it across the desk so I could see the printed numbers. He pointed to the final hormone panel, the exact test that Jessica, the coordinator, had handed to my fertility doctor on the day Julian left me. Dr. Mitchell explained that the hormone levels recorded on this paper were not just slightly off. They were statistically impossible for a woman who naturally conceived a healthy child less than 2 weeks later. He told me that human biology simply does not change that drastically overnight. I stared at the numbers, feeling a cold chill creep up my spine. "What are you saying?" I whispered. Dr. Mitchell looked me dead in the eye. He told me that the blood profile printed on this official clinic document did not belong to a 32-year-old woman struggling with fertility. He said these specific hormone markers indicated complete ovarian failure. "Abby," he said firmly, "if I were reading this report blindly, I would guarantee you that this blood belongs to a woman in her late 60s. This is the hormone profile of a post-menopausal woman." The air left my lungs completely. I stared at the piece of paper bearing my name and my date of birth. But the data underneath those identifying details belonged to an elderly woman. The pieces of the nightmare began to snap together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Julian had wanted a divorce, but he did not want to look like the bad guy. He needed a foolproof reason to leave me and demand the sale of our home. And Jessica, his new beautiful girlfriend, was the lead patient coordinator at the very clinic that produced this impossible lab report. She had access to the medical system. She handled my files. The devastating infertility diagnosis was not a tragic medical mistake. It was a manufactured lie. They had deliberately falsified my medical records to steal my future and justify my husband's betrayal. I sat in that exam room listening to the steady heartbeat of my unborn child and realized I was no longer dealing with a cruel divorce. I was the victim of a calculated medical fraud. I sat absolutely frozen in Dr. Mitchell's examination room, staring at the printed numbers on the official lab report. The rhythmic sound of my unborn baby's heartbeat was still echoing from the small ultrasound machine in the corner, but a new, deafening noise was rushing in my ears. It sounded like ocean waves crashing against rocks. A post-menopausal woman. Dr. Mitchell's words hung in the warm air of the room like heavy, thick smoke. He was sitting on his rolling stool, looking at me with deep medical concern, waiting for me to process the impossible information he had just delivered. My mind was racing backward, spinning frantically through the last 6 weeks of my life, trying to make sense of a reality that was completely shattering right in front of me. I closed my eyes tightly and pictured that freezing, sterile room at the private fertility clinic. I remembered the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a pale glow over the mahogany desk. I remembered the heavy oak door clicking open. And then, I remembered the specific woman who had walked through that door carrying this exact manila folder. She was the lead patient coordinator, a young, striking blonde woman with perfect hair and an overly sympathetic smile that had always felt just a little too practiced. I'd spent countless hours speaking to her over the phone and in person over the past year. She was the one who managed my grueling appointment schedules. She was the one who handled my massive billing statements and processed the thousands of dollars I was bleeding from my modest teacher salary. She was the one who had offered me a comforting pat on the shoulder every single time another expensive treatment cycle failed. And most importantly, she was the one who had physically handed my fertility doctor the final lab report that declared me permanently infertile. I opened my eyes and looked at Dr. Mitchell. I asked him if it was possible for blood samples to get mixed up in a high-end modern laboratory. He shook his head slowly. He explained that a clinic of that elite caliber uses strict digital barcoding systems to prevent exactly that kind of devastating mistake. He told me that a mix-up of this specific magnitude was not just incredibly rare. It was highly suspicious and practically impossible without deliberate human intervention. Suspicious. The cold word echoed loudly in my mind, and suddenly a terrifying memory crashed into my consciousness with the force of a physical blow. I thought about yesterday afternoon in the sunny corporate courtyard outside Julian's office building. I thought about the desperate, foolish hope I had felt walking up to his workplace wanting to tell him about the emergency room pregnancy test. I thought about the exact moment Julian walked out of the towering glass lobby doors. He was not alone. His fingers were tightly intertwined with the hand of his beautiful new girlfriend. I had been so deeply overwhelmed by the sudden betrayal and by my mother-in-law's vicious public attack that my brain had completely failed to process the most crucial detail of the entire scene. The woman holding my husband's hand was the lead patient coordinator from the fertility clinic. Her name was Jessica. The scattered pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with such violent physical force that I actually gasped out loud and gripped the padded edge of the examination table until my knuckles turned white. Jessica was the coordinator who handled my private medical files every week. Jessica was the woman currently dating my husband. And Jessica was the exact person who handed the fertility doctor a fake blood test belonging to an elderly woman just 2 weeks after I had actually conceived a child naturally. This was not a tragic medical error or a simple laboratory mistake. This was a highly calculated, premeditated medical fraud designed to ruin my life. The crushing heartbreak that had paralyzed me for the last month evaporated in an instant. The grief that had kept me awake crying every single night vanished completely. It was replaced by a chilling, terrifying clarity that settled deep into my bones. Julian had not simply fallen out of love with me. He had not simply grown tired of waiting for a biological family. He had met Jessica at the exact clinic where I was pouring my entire life savings and my physical health into our future. They had started a secret affair while I was injecting my stomach with painful hormones and taking out a massive second mortgage on my childhood home to pay her salary. But Julian was a regional sales director, obsessed with his pristine corporate image and his social standing. He could not just leave his loyal, hard-working wife for a younger woman without looking like an absolute monster to his friends and family. He needed a foolproof justification for abandoning our marriage. He needed a profound tragedy that would secure public sympathy and make his departure look like a heartbreaking necessity rather than a cruel, selfish betrayal. So he and Jessica weaponized my greatest fear against me. They orchestrated a fake medical diagnosis to convince me and the world that my body was permanently broken. I sat in that warm examination room, listening to the steady heartbeat of the child Julian claimed I could never give him, and I finally understood the terrifying depth of his evil. He did not just break my heart, he tried to destroy my sanity. He allowed me to believe I was fundamentally defective so he could walk away with a clean conscience. Worse, he was using that fake diagnosis to legally justify forcing the premature sale of my childhood home in the divorce, claiming he needed to recoup his wasted marital investments. He was trying to leave me homeless while secretly building a lavish life with the woman who forged my records. I was a mother preparing for war. I did not go to a standard divorce lawyer. I needed someone who understood that this was no longer just a dissolved marriage. It was a calculated financial and medical assault. The very next morning, I walked into the downtown office of Thomas Wright. Thomas was a man in his late 50s with sharp, perceptive eyes and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in the courtroom. He specialized in medical malpractice and high-stakes family law. His office smelled of rich mahogany and old books. It was a space designed for serious warfare. I sat across from his heavy desk and handed him the manila folder containing the impossible hormone panel from Dr. Mitchell. I played him the voicemail of my mother-in-law threatening me and explained exactly who Jessica was. I told him about the emergency room visit and the undeniable proof that I was carrying a child. Thomas did not offer empty sympathy. He did not hand me a tissue or tell me that everything would magically be all right. He simply put on his reading glasses and reviewed the paperwork in absolute silence. He traced the impossible hormone numbers with his pen. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes held a predatory focus that made me instantly glad he was on my side. He told me that if my suspicions were correct, we were not just looking at a bitter divorce settlement. We were looking at a massive medical fraud case. But to prove it, we needed the digital footprints. The strategy was aggressive and immediate. By Friday afternoon, Thomas drafted a formal legal demand letter directed at the elite fertility clinic. He did not ask for the printed medical charts. We already knew those were forged. He specifically requested the raw digital server logs for my patient file. He demanded the timestamps, the computer network addresses, and the specific login credentials of whoever accessed my records during the week of my final appointment. We were looking for the exact moment Jessica manipulated the data. I spent the entire weekend holding my breath, believing the truth was finally about to be exposed. I thought the clinic would see Thomas write on the letterhead and immediately hand over the evidence to save themselves. But I had deeply underestimated the lengths to which a high-end medical facility would go to protect their pristine corporate image. On Tuesday morning, Thomas called me into his office. His jaw was locked tight. He slid a heavy, cream-colored response letter from the clinic legal department across the large desk. The clinic flatly denied our request. They cited stringent patient privacy protocols, which was completely laughable considering they were my own personal medical records. But their primary excuse sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. The clinic claimed that a localized server malfunction had corrupted a small batch of patient files from that specific month. They stated that the raw digital logs I was requesting were permanently unrecoverable due to this tragic data corruption. It was a massive, impenetrable stone wall. They were actively protecting Jessica, and they were seamlessly covering their tracks to avoid a multi-million-dollar malpractice lawsuit. The corruption excuse was not a coincidence. It was a highly coordinated defense, and Julian did not waste a single second capitalizing on my legal setback. The very next day, a process server showed up at my front door again. This time, he handed me an emergency motion filed by Julian's expensive corporate divorce attorney. I stood in my kitchen reading the aggressive legal demands, while the steady heartbeat of my unborn child seemed to echo in my mind. Julian was petitioning the family court judge to completely bypass the standard mediation process and finalize the divorce immediately. But the most devastating part was the financial demand attached to the motion. Julian formally accused me of intentionally dragging out the legal proceedings purely out of bitter spite. He claimed I was a hostile party, refusing to accept the medical reality of our separation. Based on this fabricated hostility, his lawyer demanded an emergency court order to force the immediate sale of my childhood home. He wanted the house placed on the market within 30 days so he could extract the $60,000 he claimed I owed him for my biological failures. I dropped the thick stack of papers onto the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic. Julian knew exactly what he was doing. He knew I was a public high school teacher living on a modest salary. He knew the massive legal fees required to fight a wealthy fertility clinic would quickly bankrupt me. By forcing the immediate sale of my childhood home, he was trying to cut off my only remaining financial lifeline. He wanted to leave me entirely destitute, homeless, and completely incapable of affording an attorney to uncover his medical fraud. He wanted to strip me of the very walls that had protected me since I was a little girl. Julian and Jessica thought they had me trapped in a corner. They thought their coordinated legal attack would crush my spirit. They truly believed the data corruption lie would hold up in court, and I would simply surrender my home and my dignity to make the pain stop. But they forgot one crucial detail. A mother fighting for the future and safety of her child has absolutely nothing left to lose. I picked up the phone and called Thomas. I told him we were not backing down. I sat in Thomas Wright's office the following Monday morning, feeling a strange, unexpected sense of profound calm. Julian thought his emergency motion to force the immediate sale of my childhood home would finally break my spirit. He assumed the financial pressure would force me into a quiet submission. Instead, his greedy arrogance handed my attorney the exact legal crowbar he needed to pry their conspiracy wide open. Thomas did not panic when he read the aggressive court demand. He actually leaned back in his heavy leather chair and smiled. He explained that by legally claiming the $60,000 in fertility treatments as a wasted marital investment, Julian had officially made the clinic records a central financial component of our divorce settlement. Thomas immediately filed a ruthless counter motion with the family court judge. He argued forcefully that we could not possibly sell a contested marital asset to repay supposed medical debts without first verifying the absolute legitimacy of those specific medical services. The judge completely agreed. By Wednesday afternoon, Thomas had secured a massive, non-negotiable discovery subpoena signed directly by a state judge. The elite fertility clinic could no longer hide behind their convenient lies about localized data corruption. They were legally ordered to surrender their entire digital server backup, unredacted, or face immediate federal obstruction charges. The impenetrable stone wall had finally crumbled to dust. The wait for those requested documents felt like holding my breath deep underwater. Every single time my phone rang, my heart raced with a terrifying mixture of hope and dread. I continued teaching my high school English classes, trying my hardest to focus on grading literature essays and helping my students, but my mind was entirely consumed by the invisible war happening behind closed corporate doors. Finally, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks later, Thomas called my cell phone. His voice was incredibly low and strictly professional. He told me to come to his downtown office immediately after the final school bell rang. When I walked through his doors, his large mahogany desk was completely cleared off, except for a single laptop and a thick-bound printed report. The clinic legal department had officially surrendered the raw server logs. They had tried to bury the truth in thousands of pages of encrypted computer code, hoping a public school teacher and a family lawyer would simply lack the technical resources and the financial stamina to decipher their complicated medical database. But Thomas was dangerously meticulous. He had hired an independent digital forensics expert to parse every single line of data related to my specific patient file. I pulled up a heavy chair next to his desk and stared at the glowing screen. Thomas pointed his pen to a specific row on a massive spreadsheet that documented every single time a staff member accessed my medical records. The clinic software required a unique employee identification number and a secure personalized password for every single keystroke. The digital footprints were absolute, permanent, and undeniable. Thomas scrolled down slowly to the date of my final appointment, the horrific day the fertility doctor had handed me the devastating news of my permanent infertility. Then he moved his finger back exactly 1 day prior. The screen showed a sudden flurry of frantic digital activity on my file late at night. I looked closely at the timestamp. It was exactly 11 o'clock at night. The clinic had been securely locked and closed for hours. The building was completely empty, yet someone had intentionally logged into the secure main server from a remote off-site location. I asked Thomas what I was looking at. He explained that this was the exact moment my original healthy blood work showing normal hormone levels was manually deleted from the system and permanently replaced with the fraudulent postmenopausal profile. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I stared at the employee identification name attached to the 11 o'clock login. The name glaring back at me on the computer screen was Jessica Sterling, the lead patient coordinator, the beautiful young woman who is currently sleeping next to my husband in a luxury beachfront house paid for by my savings. She had used her high-level administrative clearance to deliberately bypass the standard laboratory safety protocols. At 11 o'clock at night, while I was lying in bed trying to sleep terrified and praying about my final medical appointment the next morning, Jessica was sitting at a computer orchestrating the calculated destruction of my marriage. She had manually overridden the digital safeguards, erased the biological reality of my healthy body, and uploaded a fabricated document specifically designed to convince me I was a failure as a woman and a burden to my husband. It was a staggering evil abuse of professional power. I felt a cold wave of pure, absolute clarity wash over me, settling deep into my bones. This was no longer just a sad story about a cheating husband or a bitter, hostile divorce. This was a highly sophisticated crime. Thomas closed the laptop with a sharp snap and looked at me with absolute dead certainty in his perceptive eyes. He told me that altering a patient medical record to facilitate a financial divorce settlement and steal marital equity was not just a fireable workplace offense. It was a severe, premeditated violation of federal health privacy laws. It was a documented, absolutely indisputable felony medical fraud. Jessica had arrogantly handed us the exact weapon we needed to completely destroy her promising medical career and put her in a federal prison cell. And Julian, who had aggressively demanded massive financial reimbursement based directly on those exact forged medical records, was intimately tied to every single stolen dollar. They thought I would just surrender quietly to their demands. Instead, they had unknowingly built their entire shiny new life on a fragile foundation of criminal lies, and I was finally holding the burning match that would burn it all to the absolute ground forever. We possessed the absolute digital proof that Jessica had committed a felony by altering my medical records, but Thomas Wright was not a man who fought half a war. He sat across from me in his mahogany office and tapped his gold pen against the printed server logs. Proving the medical fraud was only the first step. He reminded me that Julian had filed an aggressive emergency motion in family court, demanding the immediate forced sale of my childhood home. Julian had legally justified that vicious demand by claiming he needed to recoup exactly $60,000. He classified that massive sum as wasted marital investments spent entirely on my final 3 failed rounds of fertility treatments. Thomas looked at me with sharp, calculating eyes. He explained that if we were going to completely destroy Julian's narrative in front of a judge, we needed to audit the marriage. We needed to track every single penny of that $60,000 to prove his financial extortion was built on the exact same lies as his medical diagnosis. The following morning, Thomas introduced me to an independent forensic accountant named Gregory. Gregory was a quiet, intensely focused man in his late 50s who approached bank statements the way a seasoned detective approaches a pristine crime scene. I spent my entire weekend gathering the financial wreckage of my marriage. I pulled years of tax returns. I printed out hundreds of pages of transaction histories from the joint checking and savings accounts I had shared with Julian for nearly a decade. I handed over the heavy loan documents from the second mortgage I had desperately taken out to fund our dream of a family. I gave Gregory everything. For 4 agonizing days, I sat at my small kitchen table, grading literature essays for my high school students while Gregory locked himself in Thomas' law firm conference room, picking apart the illusion of my financial life. I knew the crushing reality of those debts intimately. I remembered the sheer suffocating panic of watching my modest teacher salary drain away month after painful month. I remembered signing massive checks with a trembling hand to cover the endless co-pays, the specialized hormone injections, and the exorbitant facility fees. According to the meticulously organized spreadsheets Julian used to show me the final 3 rounds of aggressive treatments right before he abandoned me, had cost a staggering $60,000. Julian had personally transferred that massive sum out of our joint savings, which was funded entirely by the equity of my house. He had looked me in the eye and told me he was handling the clinic billing department directly to spare me the emotional devastation of looking at the expensive invoices after every heartbreaking failure. I had believed him completely. I had genuinely believed my husband was protecting my fragile mental health from the administrative burden of our infertility journey. I had thanked him for taking on that heavy responsibility. On Thursday afternoon, my phone rang right as the final school bell echoed through the hallways. It was Thomas telling me to get to his downtown office immediately. The drive through the city felt like moving through a dense fog. The steady rhythmic heartbeat of my unborn child seemed to echo in my ears as I rode the elevator up to the law firm. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the conference room, Thomas was standing by the window, looking out over the traffic below. Gregory, the accountant, was sitting at the long, polished table with a massive binder of financial spreadsheets spread open in front of him. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense, thick with a strange, heavy anticipation. I pulled out a leather chair and sat down, gripping the armrests tightly. Gregory did not offer any polite small talk. He simply pushed a thick stack of highlighted ledgers across the smooth wood. He took off his reading glasses and explained his methodology. He had spent the last 96 hours painstakingly cross-referencing the $60,000 in massive cash withdrawals from our joint bank account against the official, itemized billing records we had legally subpoenaed from the elite fertility clinic. He had traced the exact dates of the withdrawals, the routing numbers, the wire transfers, and the digital deposit receipts. He was looking for the corresponding payments credited to my patient file. I braced myself, expecting Gregory to show me exactly how much profit the corrupt medical facility had made off my physical suffering and my manufactured despair. I expected to see Jessica forged signature on the billing approvals. Instead, Gregory picked up his pen and pointed to a glaring absolute zero at the bottom of the final clinic ledger. He looked me dead in the eye, and his voice was completely devoid of emotion. He explained that my account at the fertility clinic had actually been paid in full by my teacher health insurance months before Julian initiated those final massive withdrawals. The air rushed out of my lungs. I stared at the numbers swimming on the page, unable to comprehend what I was looking at. I asked Gregory where the $60,000 had gone if it was not used to pay for my medical treatments. Gregory leaned forward and delivered a piece of information that made the entire room spin violently out of control. They discover the clinic never received that money. Not a single dollar of that $60,000 had ever been wired to the medical facility. Julian had completely fabricated the medical debts. He had used my desperation for a child as a convenient cover story to systematically drain my life savings right before he filed for divorce, leaving me with a second mortgage and an empty bank account. He had stood in our kitchen, holding my hand, telling me we were making a vital investment in our future family while he was actively stealing the equity of my childhood home. The sheer calculation of his theft was breathtaking. He had weaponized my deepest vulnerabilities, using my intense desire to become a mother as a smokescreen for his grand larceny. I sat in that quiet conference room, realizing that every tear I had shed over those supposed financial burdens was a tear shed over a ghost. The money was gone, but it had not vanished into the sterile halls of the fertility clinic. It had been hijacked by the man who had promised to love and protect me for the rest of my life. Gregory did not stop with that empty medical ledger. The silence in the law firm conference room was absolute, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I was still trying to process the horrifying fact that the clinic had never received a single dime of my money when Gregory quietly closed the first binder. He did not offer any pity. He simply reached across the polished wooden table and pulled a second, much thicker gray folder from his leather briefcase. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a profound seriousness that made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. He explained that money in the modern banking system never truly disappears. It always leaves a digital footprint, a trail of breadcrumbs that a skilled forensic accountant can easily follow. Julian had been incredibly arrogant, assuming a public high school teacher would never possess the financial resources or the sheer willpower to hire someone like Gregory to hunt down his stolen cash. Gregory opened the gray folder and turned it toward me. The pages inside were filled with bank routing numbers, wire transfer confirmation codes, and certified deposit receipts. He pointed his pen at a series of massive transactions originating from my heavily leveraged joint savings account. If the money did not go to the fertility clinic, I asked, my voice trembling slightly in the quiet room, where exactly did Julian send it? Gregory traced a line across the page to a receiving account under a corporate name I had never seen before in my life. The entity was registered as Apex Coastal Properties, a limited liability company that had been quietly incorporated just 4 months prior. I stared at the corporate name, completely confused. Julian was a regional sales director. We had absolutely no investments in coastal real estate. I asked Gregory who owned this mysterious shell company. Thomas Wright. My attorney leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He told me they had pulled the state business registry files that very morning to find the registered agent of the company. The sole owner and operator of the shell company was a man named Michael Sterling. The last name struck me with the force of a physical blow. Sterling. It was not a common name in our social circle, but it was a name that had been permanently burned into my memory over the past few weeks. It was Jessica's last name, the beautiful young patient coordinator who had handed my doctor the fake post-menopausal blood test, the woman who was currently sleeping next to my husband. Michael Sterling was her older brother. The intricate, sickening architecture of their conspiracy finally revealed itself in full detail. Julian had not just casually drained our savings in a moment of panic. He had methodically and deliberately structured a sophisticated theft over the course of several months. He had moved my money in strategic, carefully calculated increments under the perfect disguise of medical copays, specialized hormone treatments, and exorbitant facility fees. Every time he sat at our kitchen table and promised he was taking care of the complicated clinic billing to spare my fragile emotions, he was actually wiring my hard-earned teacher salary and the precious equity of my childhood home directly into the hands of his mistress's family. But Michael Sterling was merely a convenient middleman in their elaborate criminal enterprise. The shell company was created for one specific purpose. Thomas flipped to the final section of the gray folder and placed a glossy, full-color real estate printout directly in front of me. It was a property deed and a listing for a breathtaking luxury beachfront home located in a highly exclusive coastal town just 40 miles away from my modest neighborhood. The house featured panoramic ocean views, a sprawling master suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a custom chef's kitchen. It was the exact kind of pristine, high-status property Julian had always obsessed over. Thomas pointed to the financial closing documents attached to the listing. The $60,000 that Julian had stolen from my accounts had been used in its entirety to cover the massive 20% down payment on this beachfront paradise. And the most devastating detail was the timeline. The final closing signature on the property deed was dated exactly 3 days before Julian packed his leather suitcases, stood in our master bedroom, and coldly told me he was abandoning our marriage because I was a broken, useless woman. I sat in that heavy leather chair and stared at the glossy photographs of their brand new luxury life. I thought about the agonizing physical pain of the hormone injections that left my stomach covered in dark purple bruises. I thought about the cheap sandwiches I packed for lunch every single day and the shoes with worn-out soles I wore to my classroom, all to save every possible penny for our dream of having a baby. I'd voluntarily placed a second mortgage on the only home I had ever loved, the house my grandparents had worked so hard to leave me. I had willingly destroyed my own financial security because I believed my husband and I were fighting a heartbreaking biological battle together. Instead, Julian had weaponized my profound desperation for a child. He had used my deepest vulnerability to secretly purchase a $1 million vacation home with the very woman who had forged my medical records. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal transcended simple infidelity. It was a breathtaking, calculated evil that left me entirely speechless. I did not cry. I had shed my final tear for Julian Hayes in the emergency room weeks ago. As I looked at the undeniable proof of his grand larceny, the suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest completely evaporated. In its place, a cold, absolute fury settled deep into my bones. Julian and Jessica truly believed they had committed the perfect crime. They thought they could leave me destitute, homeless, and utterly humiliated while they sipped champagne on their stolen oceanfront balcony. They assumed I was just a naive, weak school teacher who would quietly accept my tragic fate and surrender my childhood home without a fight. They had drastically underestimated the woman they were dealing with. They had unknowingly handed me the exact financial and digital weapons I needed to tear their shiny new empire to the ground. I looked up from the property deed, met my attorney's perceptive eyes, and told him it was time to spring the trap. The sharp, blinding pain of labor was nothing compared to the agonizing heartbreak of the previous 9 months. When the nurses finally placed Leo on my chest in that quiet hospital room, the entire world outside simply ceased to exist. He was a perfectly healthy baby boy with a thick head of dark hair and tiny grasping fingers that immediately wrapped around my thumb. I lay there in the crisp hospital bed, exhausted to my very bones, and wept. They were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of absolute triumph. For 6 years, my body had been treated like a failing medical experiment. I had been called empty, broken, and barren by the man who promised to love me forever. but feeling the warm, steady weight of my son breathing against my skin, I knew I had never been broken at all. I was a mother. Leo was the undeniable living proof of my truth, and looking down at his sweet sleeping face, every single painful hormone injection and every agonizing night I spent crying alone suddenly felt completely worth it. But the reality of my fractured life could not be kept outside the delivery room door forever. Despite the mountain of evidence proving Julian had orchestrated a massive medical fraud, he was still legally Leo's father. My attorney Thomas had advised me that we needed to send a formal notification of the birth to establish a documented paper trail of Julian's parental negligence. I did not want to do it. The thought of inviting that man's toxic energy into the sacred space of my son's first day on Earth made my stomach turn. But I followed my lawyer's instructions. I typed out a brief, strictly factual message stating that his son had been born healthy and safe. I pressed send and set the phone face down on the bedside table. I spent the next 24 hours holding my breath. A small, foolish part of me wondered if becoming a father would finally shatter the delusion Julian was living in. I wondered if the reality of a living, breathing child would snap him out of his cruel narcissism. The phone never rang. There was no desperate rush to the hospital, no tearful apologies, no bouquet of flowers, and no reply to the message. Julian completely ignored the birth of the very child he had used to destroy my marriage. The silence was absolute and deafening. He had spent years demanding a legacy, draining my finances to create a family, and when that family finally arrived, he could not even be bothered to acknowledge his own flesh and blood. 3 days later, I was back in my childhood home, sitting in a second-hand rocking chair in the corner of the nursery. The room was simple, decorated with thrifted books and hand-me-down baby clothes from my supportive colleagues at the high school. I was nursing Leo in the quiet afternoon light, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. The house was calm. My son was safe, but the fragile bubble of peace burst when my phone buzzed on the side table. It was a message from a well-meaning mutual friend who had not yet realized the true depth of Julian's betrayal. The message contained a link to a local society page with a single line of text asking if I had seen it. My chest tightened as I tapped the screen. The page loaded to display a massive, glossy photo spread. It was an exclusive engagement announcement for Julian Hayes and Jessica Sterling. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. The photos were sickeningly lavish. Julian was wearing a custom-tailored linen suit. Jessica was draped in an expensive designer silk dress, her blonde hair blowing perfectly in the ocean breeze. They were standing on the expansive wooden deck of a breathtaking coastal property. It was the exact same luxury beachfront house Julian had secretly purchased using the $60,000 he stole from our joint savings account. He had used the money I bled myself dry to save the equity from the very house I was currently sitting in to buy his mistress a seaside palace. In the final photograph, Jessica held her hand up to the camera, showing off a massive, flawless diamond ring. The caption underneath the photo read that the happy couple was celebrating their new chapter and looking forward to building a family together in their dream home. The sheer audacity of it literally took my breath away. They were posting photos of a house bought with stolen money, flaunting a diamond ring purchased through medical fraud, all while Julian actively ignored the newborn son sleeping in my arms. I locked my phone and set it aside, feeling a cold wave of financial terror crash over me. The peaceful afternoon suddenly felt like a luxury I could not afford. The brutal reality of my situation was stark and terrifying. I was a single mother on a modest public school teacher salary. I was sitting in a house heavily burdened by a fraudulent second mortgage that Julian had forced upon me. The ongoing legal battle was becoming astronomically expensive. Thomas was a brilliant attorney, and the forensic accountants had successfully uncovered the money trail, but those professional services required massive retainers. Every subpoena, every motion filed in family court, every hour spent preparing the medical malpractice lawsuit was draining the last few pennies I had to my name. The financial strain was suffocating. I lay awake every night staring at the ceiling, doing terrible math in my head, calculating how many weeks I had left before the bank foreclosed on my childhood home. I was facing absolute bankruptcy. Julian and Jessica were counting on it. They were dragging out the divorce proceedings, deliberately banking on the fact that I would run out of money before I could ever expose their crimes in a courtroom. They wanted to starve me out, force me into a quiet settlement, and leave me destitute while they lived happily ever after on the beach. I looked down at Leo. He had finished nursing and was sleeping soundly against my chest, completely unaware of the massive invisible war raging around him. I smoothed my hand over his soft dark hair and felt a fierce, terrifying maternal resolve lock into place. They thought they could break me by taking my money. They thought they could erase me by posting shiny pictures of a stolen life. But they had severely underestimated the sheer willpower of a mother protecting her child. I pulled my son closer, breathing in the sweet scent of his skin, and swore a silent oath to him right there in the rocking chair. I was not going to quietly accept bankruptcy. I was not going to let them win. I was going to take back every single stolen dollar, and I was going to make sure the entire world knew exactly who they really were. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the fragile piece of my new life was shattered. I had strapped Leo into his carrier and walked to the local grocery store to pick up fresh vegetables and baby formula. I was surviving. I was keeping my son fed, safe, and loved, despite the looming shadow of bankruptcy threatening to swallow us whole. I was standing in the produce aisle, gently rocking the carrier back and forth while inspecting a bundle of spinach when I felt that familiar heavy prickle of someone watching me. I turned my head and my breath hitched painfully in my throat. Standing less than 10 feet away, holding a woven shopping basket, was Barbara, my former mother-in-law. She had frozen completely in place. Her perfect posture had stiffened, and her eyes were locked onto the carrier strapped to my chest. She took 2 steps closer, peering directly at the baby she had publicly sworn was a fake. She looked at Leo, and the truth hit her with the undeniable force of a freight train. Leo was only a few weeks old, but genetics are a funny, stubborn thing. He did not look like me. He was the absolute spitting image of Julian. He had Julian exact dark hair, the same shape of his jaw, the same distinctive slope of his brow. Looking at my infant son was like looking at a miniature, undeniable replica of the man who had abandoned us. I watched the blood drain completely out of Barbara's face. The smug, superior mask she always wore slipped, entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. She knew. In that single silent moment, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the grocery store, Barbara knew her son had lied. She knew the infertility diagnosis was a sham, and she knew the baby I was holding was her own flesh and blood grandson. I braced myself. A tiny, foolish part of my heart thought she might break down, that she might reach out and apologize, that seeing her grandson would melt the ice in her veins. Instead, her eyes narrowed into dark, vicious slits. She did not see a grandson. She saw a massive breathing liability. "You have some nerve showing your face in public," she hissed, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of fear and malice. I instinctively wrapped my arms around Leo, stepping back. "Leave us alone, Barbara," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "You know exactly who this baby is. He is Julian's son, and you know it." She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. "You are a deeply disturbed woman, Abby," she spat, taking another aggressive step forward. "Julian has moved on. He is marrying a successful woman, and you are trying to ruin his happiness. You need psychiatric help." She turned on her heel and ran down the aisle. I rushed home, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. I locked the front door, pulled the curtains shut, and held Leo tightly against my chest. I thought her cruel words were the extent of her attack, but I was completely wrong. Barbara was not just angry. She was terrified. She realized that Leo's mere existence, his undeniable physical resemblance to Julian, was a ticking time bomb that would completely destroy her son, pristine corporate reputation, and his fake narrative of the tragic infertile marriage. She needed to eliminate the threat, and she decided to use the state to do it. 3 hours later, a loud, authoritative knock echoed through my quiet house. I opened the front door to find 2 strangers standing on my porch holding clipboards. They flashed official badges. They were investigators from Child Protective Services. One of them, a stern-looking woman, explained that they had received an emergency anonymous report regarding the immediate safety of my infant son. I stepped back, completely stunned, allowing them inside. The woman read from her file, and every word made me feel like I was plunging into freezing water. The caller, who I knew with absolute certainty, was Barbara, claimed that I was living in extreme squalor. Instead of accepting her grandson, Barbara maliciously files a false CPS report, claiming Abby is living in squalor and experiencing postpartum psychosis, hoping to get Leo taken away before Julian's reputation is ruined. The anonymous report detailed horrific fabricated lies. It stated that I was starving my baby, leaving him unattended for hours, and suffering from violent delusional episodes of postpartum psychosis. Barbara was actively trying to have my newborn son ripped from my arms and placed into the foster care system just to protect her cheating son from public embarrassment. The sheer breathtaking evil of her actions paralyzed me for a moment. The investigators walked through my modest childhood home. They checked my pantry, which was fully stocked with formula and baby food. They inspected Leo Nursery, noting the safe environment. They looked at me, a terrified but clearly sober and competent mother holding a healthy, well-fed baby boy. After a thorough 45-minute inspection, the investigators closed their files. The stern woman offered me a sympathetic, weary sigh. She told me that it was abundantly clear this was a malicious, retaliatory, false report. She assured me my son was perfectly safe and that they would be closing the investigation immediately. They left, leaving me standing in the center of my living room, trembling with a rage so profound it actually scared me. Barbara thought she could use the government as a weapon to steal my child and silence me forever. She thought her false report would break me down and force me to surrender. But as I held Leo close, feeling his tiny heartbeat against my chest, the fear completely evaporated. Barbara had just made the biggest miscalculation of her life. She had handed my attorney a documented official paper trail of severe harassment, and she had just triggered the legal trap that would eventually destroy them all. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving my small house in absolute silence. The Child Protective Services investigators were gone. I stood in the center of my living room, holding my infant son so tightly against my chest that I could feel the rapid fluttering of his tiny heart. Barbara had tried to use the power of the state to rip my baby from my arms. She had manufactured vile, disgusting lies about my mental health and my home to protect her son's pristine corporate image. But as I stood there breathing in the sweet scent of Leo's soft hair, the terrifying panic that had gripped me all afternoon completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. Barbara thought she was delivering a fatal blow to a weak, exhausted single mother. Instead, she had just handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy them. 3 days later, the official clearance document arrived in my mailbox. The state had formally classified the anonymous tip as a malicious and entirely unfounded retaliatory report. I did not even bother going back inside my house. I put Leo in his car seat, drove straight downtown, and walked directly into the mahogany office of my attorney. Thomas Wright was sitting behind his massive desk, reviewing a stack of depositions. I dropped the government letter directly onto the polished wood in front of him. I told him exactly what Barbara had done in the grocery store and what she had done over the phone to the state investigators. I told him she was loudly and publicly claiming I was committing paternity fraud. Thomas picked up the letter and read it carefully. He did not offer any empty apologies for my distress. Instead, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He took off his reading glasses and looked at me with bright, calculating eyes. He explained that Barbara had just made the most catastrophic mistake of this entire divorce. By weaponizing the accusation of paternity fraud on a recorded government line, she had unknowingly given us the ultimate legal leverage. Thomas explained that family court judges absolutely despise malicious Child Protective Service reports. We now had a documented, compelling reason to demand a rigid court-ordered DNA test to clear my name and protect my son from further harassment. The trap was absolutely perfect. Julian had built his entire divorce strategy on the lie that I was permanently infertile. If he refused the test, he would look incredibly guilty and hostile in front of the judge. If he took the test, the biological reality of his paternity would permanently dismantle his entire medical fraud. The emergency hearing took place the following Tuesday morning in a crowded downtown courthouse. I sat at the plaintiff table wearing a conservative gray suit, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Julian walked through the heavy swinging doors a few minutes later, and he looked terrible. The polished, charismatic sales director image was rapidly fraying at the edges. His face was pale, and he was sweating through the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His high-priced corporate attorney immediately launched into a frantic, aggressive defense. He paced in front of the judge, a stern older woman who looked entirely unimpressed by his theatrical hand gestures. Julian's lawyer argued that a mandatory DNA test was a complete waste of judicial resources and a gross invasion of his client's privacy. He claimed Julian had already accepted the tragic medical reality of my infertility and was simply trying to move on with his life. He accused me of using the child to extort a better financial settlement. Thomas did not pace. He simply stood up, his voice booming across the quiet courtroom with absolute authority. He presented the Malicious Child Protective Services report. He detailed Barbara's public harassment and her recorded claims of a fake pregnancy. Thomas looked directly at Julian and stated that if my ex-husband truly believed this child belonged to another man, he should be eager to take a simple cheek swab to legally sever all financial ties forever. The courtroom fell completely silent. The judge narrowed her eyes and glared down at Julian from her elevated bench. She did not ask for his opinion. She issued a binding legal order right then and there. Julian panicked. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He stammered out a desperate excuse, claiming he was traveling for work and simply did not have the time to schedule a medical appointment this month. The judge slammed her gavel down with a sharp, deafening crack. She leaned over the bench and her voice dripped with absolute authority. She told Julian that he was not being invited to a medical appointment. He was being ordered by the state. She looked him dead in the eye and promised him that if he did not submit to a supervised DNA swab within 48 hours, she would hold him in immediate contempt of court and have him waiting in a county jail cell until he found the time to comply. Julian sank back into his chair, his face completely drained of color. The illusion was over, and the court-approved testing facility was located in a drab gray municipal building on the edge of the city. It was the exact opposite of the luxurious elite fertility clinic where Jessica had forged my records. There was no soft instrumental music, no plush seating, and no overly sympathetic coordinators. There were only bare walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and strict chain of custody protocols. I arrived first with Leo. A court-appointed official verified my government identification and took my thumbprint before gently swabbing the inside of my sleeping baby's cheek. The swab was sealed in a tamper-proof plastic vial right in front of my eyes. 10 minutes later, Julian walked into the waiting room. He did not bring his expensive lawyer, and he did not bring his beautiful new fiancée. He was completely alone. He looked at me sitting in the plastic waiting room chair, holding the son he had abandoned. He did not say a single word. He could not even bring himself to look at Leo's face. The court official called his name and directed him to a sterile examination chair in the corner of the room. I watched closely. As the nurse handed Julian the long cotton swab, his hands were shaking so violently that he almost dropped it on the linoleum floor. Julian slowly opened his mouth and swabbed the inside of his cheek. In that brief, silent moment, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, the entire foundation of his fake life crumbled to dust. He watched the nurse drop his genetic sample into the secure plastic vial and seal it with a bright red evidence sticker. The physical reality of what he had just done washed over him. The scientific proof of his paternity was now locked in a state-regulated system completely out of his control and impossible for Jessica to manipulate. Julian stood up, grabbed his jacket, and practically ran out of the facility doors without looking back. He knew the timer had just started ticking, and there was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. The heavy glass door of Thomas Wright's office swung shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the busy downtown street. It was a crisp Thursday morning, exactly 4 days after the tense DNA swabbing at the county facility. I was holding a sealed courier envelope that had just been delivered to my house. I had not opened it yet. I wanted to open it here in the fortress of mahogany and legal volumes where we had built our entire counterattack. Thomas was sitting behind his wide desk, watching me with those sharp, perceptive eyes. He did not rush me. He knew exactly what was inside that envelope. It was the scientific reality that would finally break the illusion Julian had spent months carefully constructing. I sat down in the leather chair across from him and slid my finger under the paper flap. My hands were perfectly steady. The terrifying panic that had haunted me for the past year was completely gone, replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. I pulled out the crisp white laboratory report and unfolded it on the polished wood. The state seal was printed clearly at the top, alongside the strict chain of custody documentation. I scanned past the complex genetic markers and the scientific terminology until I found the final summarized conclusion at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Julian Hayes was undeniably, mathematically, and legally the biological father of my son Leo. The child he claimed I had cheated to conceive. The child his mother had tried to rip away from me using Child Protective Services. The child he had completely abandoned to play house with his new, beautiful girlfriend. I stared at the percentage printed in bold black ink and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of vindication wash through my entire body. For months, Julian and Jessica had spun a vicious public narrative painting me as a delusional, unstable woman desperate to steal his assets by pinning another man's baby on him. They had weaponized my reputation to protect their own, but science does not care about corporate images or country club gossip. Science only cares about the truth. I pushed the paper across the desk toward my attorney. Thomas picked it up and read the results. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He set the paper down and leaned back in his heavy chair. He told me that this was the final nail in the coffin. With this certified genetic match, we had officially crossed the line from a bitter family dispute into a massive criminal conspiracy. The DNA test did not just prove Julian was a terrible father. It legally established the exact timeline of my pregnancy. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had conceived a healthy child naturally, weeks before the elite fertility clinic declared me permanently infertile. Thomas opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of legal binders. He had been working late into the night for weeks preparing for this exact moment. He spread the binders across the desk. Inside was every piece of ammunition we had gathered. The raw digital server logs showing Jessica manually altering my hormone levels at 11:00 at night. The forensic accounting reports proving Julian had stolen $60,000 to buy a beachfront property while claiming it was medical debt. And now, the court-ordered DNA test that bound the entire timeline of fraud together into one undeniable package. We are not just filing a standard medical malpractice claim. Thomas explained, his voice dropping to a serious professional tone. We are filing a comprehensive federal lawsuit for felony medical fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and grand larceny. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that we were going after all of them. Jessica would lose her medical license and face federal prison time for tampering with secure health records. Julian would be exposed for embezzling marital assets to fund his secret life, and the elite fertility clinic would be held entirely liable for allowing a patient coordinator to weaponize their secure medical network to destroy a marriage. I listened to the sheer magnitude of the legal destruction Thomas had prepared, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity. They had tried to leave me homeless and bankrupt. They had forced me to question my own sanity. They had allowed a mother to believe her body was broken just so a cowardly man could walk away looking like a tragic hero. They deserved every single consequence coming their way. I picked up a pen from the desk. Thomas handed me the final affidavit. I signed my name in clear dark ink, officially authorizing the massive lawsuit. But as Thomas reached out to collect the paperwork, I stopped him. I looked at the calendar hanging on his office wall. The exclusive beachside wedding Julian and Jessica had been planning for months was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday. They had invited 200 of the wealthiest investors, doctors, and church members in the city. They were preparing to celebrate their beautiful love story, built entirely on my stolen money and my manufactured grief. I told Thomas I did not want to file the lawsuit today. I did not want a quiet process server knocking on Julian's corporate office door on a random Thursday afternoon. They had humiliated me publicly for a year. They had let Barbara scream at me in a crowded courtyard and accuse me of being a tramp. I wanted them to feel the exact same level of public absolute devastation they had put me through. Thomas understood immediately. He agreed to file the massive indictment under a strict judicial seal, keeping the impending legal hurricane completely hidden from the public record for just a few more days. Julian and Jessica would spend the rest of the week sipping champagne, trying on expensive tailored suits, and smiling for pre-wedding photographs, completely oblivious to the fact that their destruction was already signed and certified. They thought they had finally won. They thought they had buried me forever. They had no idea I was quietly packing my bags, preparing to deliver the absolute truth directly to their head table. The invitations for the wedding were printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold foil lettering. I know this because a mutual acquaintance had quietly slipped one into my mailbox out of sheer pity. The venue was the Ocean Cliff Country Club, the most exclusive and outrageously expensive beachfront property in the entire state. Julian and Jessica were sparing absolutely no expense to celebrate their stolen happiness. For weeks leading up to the ceremony, they had been carefully spinning a masterful and sickening public narrative. Julian was playing the role of the tragic, long-suffering hero. He painted himself as a devoted man who had finally escaped a deeply toxic and bitterly barren wife. He told his wealthy corporate investors and his country club friends that I had driven him to the brink of despair with my emotional instability and my refusal to accept medical reality. Barbara, of course, was his loudest cheerleader. She took this fabricated tragedy straight to her conservative church community. She stood in the fellowship hall on Sunday mornings, dabbing her eyes with a lace tissue, telling anyone who would listen how her poor son had survived years of my manipulative abuse. She claimed I was a deeply disturbed woman who had tried to trap him with a baby fathered by a random stranger, just out of pure spite and greed. They were throwing a massive glamorous party to celebrate his survival and his beautiful new beginning with the young, vibrant fertility clinic coordinator who had magically healed his broken heart. The sheer audacity of their lies was breathtaking. They were standing on a stage built entirely from my stolen life savings and my forged medical records, soaking up the sympathy and admiration of 200 elite guests. But behind the scenes, away from the country club tours and the expensive cake tastings, Julian was growing increasingly desperate. He knew the clock was ticking. He knew I had not just quietly surrendered my childhood home as he had aggressively demanded in his initial family court filings. He knew I was fighting back, even if he did not yet know the full extent of the weapons I held. So exactly 4 days before the wedding, he decided to turn up the pressure to an unbearable level. I was sitting in the quiet nursery feeding Leo when my phone rang. It was Thomas, my attorney. His voice was tight with professional irritation. He told me that Julian's expensive corporate lawyer had just sent over a final aggressive settlement offer. I packed Leo into his car seat, secured him safely, and drove straight through the morning traffic to Thomas's downtown office. When I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from Thomas, he slid a thin stack of legal papers across the mahogany desk. It was a completely insulting divorce decree. Julian was offering to temporarily drop his demand to force the immediate sale of my house, but only if I signed away all rights to his retirement accounts, waived my right to any financial reimbursement for the $60,000 he had stolen, and agreed to a strict, permanent non-disclosure clause. He wanted to throw me a few pennies to make me go quietly away, but the absolute worst part was the vicious threat attached to the bottom of the document. If I refused to sign this quiet settlement before his wedding weekend, Julian promised to drag out a highly public and brutal custody battle over Leo for years. He threatened to use his substantial corporate income and Barbara's church connections to paint me as an unfit, unstable mother. He explicitly stated he would bleed me dry in family court until I was completely bankrupt and broken, ensuring I would lose both my home and my son. He was using the child he had completely ignored for 8 months as a legal weapon to extort my silence and secure his stolen wealth. He wanted me terrified, submissive, and financially paralyzed. I stared at the crisp white pages of the settlement offer. A few months ago, reading a threat like this would have sent me into a total panic. I would have cried uncontrollably. I would have wondered how a public school teacher could possibly afford to fight a wealthy corporate director in a rigged system. I would have signed the paper just to protect my baby from the trauma of a prolonged legal war. Julian was banking entirely on that old version of me. He thought the exhausted, heartbroken woman he had abandoned in that freezing fertility clinic was still the woman sitting in this law office. He had no idea that grief had burned away entirely, leaving behind a mother who was ready to burn his fake empire to the ground. I looked up from the paper and met Thomas's perceptive eyes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble or ask for a moment to collect myself. I asked Thomas what would happen if we ignored the deadline and let Julian proceed with his wedding. Thomas smiled a sharp, predatory expression that I had come to appreciate deeply over the last few months. He reminded me that we already held the court-ordered DNA test, proving Julian was the biological father of the child he was using as a pawn. We held the raw digital server logs, proving Jessica had committed felony medical fraud by manually altering my hormone panels. And we held the meticulous forensic accounting reports, proving Julian had embezzled marital funds to buy the very beach house where he was hosting his lavish wedding reception. The federal indictment was fully prepared, signed, and waiting securely under a strict judicial seal. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting on Thomas's desk. I did not sign on the dotted line. Instead, I drew a slow, deliberate line straight through the entire settlement offer, pressing hard enough to leave an indent on the wood underneath. I pushed the ruined document back across the polished desk. I told Thomas to let them think they had won for just a few more days. I wanted Julian and Jessica to spend their rehearsal dinner smiling, sipping expensive champagne, and accepting early wedding gifts. I wanted them to stand in front of their wealthy friends and Barbara's church community feeling entirely invincible and untouchable. Because the higher they built their pedestal of lies, the harder the fall was going to be. The quiet, compliant wife Julian thought he knew was dead, and I was going to deliver my rejection to his settlement offer in person, directly to his head table. I left Thomas Wright's office that afternoon, leaving the insulting settlement offer sitting unsigned on his heavy mahogany desk. Julian had genuinely believed his cruel threat of a prolonged custody battle would terrify me into absolute submission. He thought the prospect of massive legal debt and the fear of losing my child would force me to quietly surrender my dignity, my childhood home, and the truth, just to protect my baby. He expected me to fold. But as I drove back through the city traffic toward my quiet neighborhood, I did not feel any of the suffocating fear he was counting on. Instead, I felt an incredible, terrifying calm. The man who had abandoned me in a freezing fertility clinic room no longer had any power over my mind or my emotions. He was simply a coward, hiding behind forged medical records and stolen marital equity. I was a mother holding the absolute truth. I was not going to negotiate with a thief. I was not going to beg for scraps of my own money. And I was certainly not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement to protect a woman who had committed a federal crime against my body. I was going to deliver the severe consequences of his actions directly to his head table. Saturday morning arrived with bright coastal sunshine and clear, endless blue skies. It was the exact kind of picture-perfect weather Julian and Jessica had undoubtedly paid a massive premium to secure for their exclusive country club wedding event. I woke up early before the neighborhood even began to stir. The house was perfectly quiet except for the soft, happy sounds of Leo cooing in his crib. I walked into the nursery and looked down at my beautiful 8-month-old son. He was sitting up, chewing happily on a small stuffed bear. He had Julian's exact dark hair and the same distinctive shape of his jaw. He was a living, undeniable biological reality that was about to completely shatter his father's carefully constructed corporate image and destroy his mother's vicious lies about my fidelity. I lifted Leo from his crib, holding his warm, solid little body against my chest. I breathed in the sweet, clean scent of his baby shampoo. Today was the day we were taking our lives back from the people who had tried to erase us. I did not rush. I moved through the quiet morning with the deliberate, careful precision of a woman preparing for an unavoidable war. While Julian and Jessica were likely spending their morning surrounded by eager bridesmaids and wealthy groomsmen sipping expensive champagne and taking staged getting ready. Photographs for social media, I was standing in my modest bedroom putting on my armor. I was not going to crash this wedding looking like the bitter, exhausted, discarded wife they had described to their elite guests. I was not going to let Barbara look down on me with her usual smug pity. My parents, who had stood by me through every single agonizing moment of this nightmare, had insisted on buying me something special for this exact day. They knew I had drained every penny I had fighting this brutal legal battle. They had taken me shopping and paid for a stunning, understated designer dress. I slipped the heavy tailored emerald green silk over my shoulders. It fit my body perfectly. It was not flashy. It did not scream for desperate attention. It simply commanded quiet, absolute respect. I brushed my hair until it shone, applied a simple, elegant touch of makeup, and put on a pair of sensible, classic heels. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror for a long time. The broken, weeping woman who had begged Julian to stay in our master bedroom was completely gone. In her place stood a strong, capable woman who knew exactly what she was worth and exactly what she was owed. I walked into the bright kitchen and began packing Leo's diaper bag. It was a stylish, structured leather bag that did not look like typical infant gear. I meticulously packed his bottles of formula, a stack of fresh diapers, a change of clothes, and his favorite soft blue blanket. It was the ordinary, beautiful, grounding routine of a devoted single mother taking care of her child. But right next to the baby wipes and the extra pacifiers, I slid in something else entirely. I carefully packed the thick, heavy legal binders that Thomas had prepared and sealed in his law office. The weight of the paper felt substantial and powerful in my hands. Inside those unassuming black binders was the absolute destruction of Julian's fake empire. The court-certified DNA test, proving his paternity with 99.9% mathematical certainty. The meticulous forensic accounting spreadsheets tracing my stolen $60,000 directly to his beachfront real estate down payment. And the raw digital server logs proving Jessica had committed felony medical fraud to fake my permanent infertility at 11 o'clock at night. I zipped the heavy leather bag shut. The mundane, comforting tools of motherhood were now resting right against the devastating federal indictments. I carried the bag out to the car and placed it securely in the passenger seat. Then I went back inside for my son. I dressed Leo in a handsome little navy blue sweater and soft khaki pants. He looked absolutely perfect, entirely innocent of the massive conflict he was about to be carried into. I secured him safely in his car seat in the back of my sensible sedan. As I closed the car door and walked around to the driver's seat, I did not feel any lingering hesitation. I did not feel any sorrow for the 10-year marriage I had lost. I only felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of impending justice. Julian thought he had won the game. He thought he was walking down a rose-petal-covered aisle to a pristine new life built entirely on my tears and my stolen savings. He had no idea I was already on the road bringing the one thing he could never outrun. It was time to audit a wedding. The drive to the Ocean Cliff Country Club took exactly 45 minutes, but it felt like I was moving through an entirely different lifetime. I spent the journey in complete silence, with the car radio turned off. I needed a perfectly clear head. I needed to focus on the rhythmic breathing of my son sleeping softly in his car seat in the back. As I pulled my sensible sedan up the winding coastal road, the sprawling architecture of the elite country club came into view. It was an intimidating fortress of wealth and privilege. Massive stone pillars framed the entrance, and luxury vehicles lined the valet lane. Julian and Jessica had spared absolutely no expense for their big day. They were spending my hard-earned savings to feed 200 of the wealthiest people in our city. I bypassed the valet stand and parked my car near the edge of the lot. I unbuckled my son, lifted his warm, solid weight into my arms, and smoothed the wrinkles from his tiny navy blue sweater. I took one deep breath of the crisp, salty ocean air. I was not the terrified, broken woman Julian had abandoned. I was a mother carrying the undeniable truth. I walked toward the massive, glowing reception tent, set up on the immaculate back lawn of the property. The sound of a live jazz band drifted through the cool evening breeze, mixing with the low hum of expensive conversations. The entire area was bathed in warm golden light from hundreds of hanging string bulbs. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of imported champagne and delicate appetizers. As I approached the main entrance of the grand tent, a young usher in a tailored suit stepped directly into my path. He looked completely confused by my presence. I did not have a brightly wrapped wedding gift. I was not wearing a pastel bridesmaid dress, and I was carrying an infant to an adults-only high society event. He held up a hand and politely asked for my name to check the master guest list. I did not stop walking. I did not even break my stride. I looked the young man dead in the eye with a level of cold, absolute authority that made him instantly freeze in place. I stepped right past him without saying a single word. He was too stunned by my sheer confidence to call for security. He simply stepped aside and let the storm walk right through the front doors. The interior of the reception tent was breathtakingly opulent. Floor-to-ceiling sheer white fabric draped elegantly from the vaulted ceiling. Massive centerpieces of imported white roses and rare orchids sat on dozens of round tables covered in heavy silk linens. 200 elite guests were seated laughing loudly and clinking their crystal glasses. These were Julian's corporate investors, local politicians, Jessica's wealthy medical colleagues, and the prominent members of Barbara's conservative church. They were all dressed in designer gowns and expensive tuxedos, blissfully unaware that the lavish party they were currently enjoying was funded entirely by felony medical fraud and stolen marital equity. In my arms, 8-month-old Leo woke up completely. He did not cry or fuss. He was utterly mesmerized by the grand spectacle unfolding around him. He stared wide-eyed at the twinkling fairy lights suspended above us. He reached his tiny hand out toward the glowing crystal chandeliers, fascinated by the sparkling reflections dancing across the ceiling. He looked absolutely angelic. He also looked exactly like a miniature, undeniable replica of the groom standing at the front of the room. He possessed Julian's exact dark hair and his unmistakable sharp jawline. My son was the living, breathing evidence of their massive deception, and he was staring innocently at the lights while I carried him directly into the center of the battlefield. I stepped onto the pristine white runner carpet that served as the center aisle of the reception space. I began to walk slowly and deliberately toward the head table. The jazz band was playing a soft romantic melody, but as I moved deeper into the crowded room, a strange and powerful ripple effect began to occur. The guests sitting at the back tables noticed me first. The lively conversations at those tables suddenly dropped to hushed, shocked whispers. People turned in their seats to stare openly at the woman in the emerald green dress holding a baby. The ripple of silence moved forward, like a tidal wave catching the tables in the middle of the room. The clinking of expensive silverware stopped abruptly. The booming laughter faded into an eerie, heavy quiet. By the time I was halfway down the aisle, the silence in the massive tent was absolutely deafening. 200 powerful people were staring directly at me. The band leader noticed the abrupt shift in the atmosphere and immediately signaled the musicians to stop playing. The sudden lack of music made the tension in the air feel thick and suffocating. At the very front of the room, sitting at a long table covered in white silk and cascading floral arrangements, was my former mother-in-law. Barbara was dressed in a shimmering silver evening gown, holding court with the wealthy parents of the bride. She had a crystal flute of champagne in her hand, and a smug, deeply satisfied smile on her face. She was basking in the glory of her son's manufactured success and soaking up the admiration of her church friends. As the unnatural, suffocating silence washed over the front of the tent, Barbara turned her head to see what had captured the attention of the entire crowd. Her eyes scanned the long center aisle and locked directly onto me. Her gaze traveled quickly from my face down to the 8-month-old boy, resting comfortably against my hip. The smug, superior smile vanished from her face so fast, it looked like she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. All the color drained completely out of her perfectly made-up cheeks, leaving her looking pale and utterly terrified. Her fingers simply went slack. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped right out of her loose grip. It hit the solid marble dance floor in front of her table and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp, loud crash of breaking glass echoed violently through the dead, silent room. It was the exact sound of their fake empire finally cracking wide open. The sharp sound of Barbara dropping her crystal champagne flute echoed like a gunshot through the silent reception tent. But at the very front of the room, Julian had not noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He was standing on a slightly elevated wooden stage under an archway of imported white orchids, holding a silver microphone. He was entirely captivated by his own performance. His eyes were closed in feigned emotion, and his free hand rested tenderly over his heart. Jessica stood right beside him, wearing a custom lace wedding gown that sparkled under the golden chandelier light. She was gazing up at him with absolute adoration. Julian took a slow, theatrical breath and leaned into the microphone. "I want to thank every single one of you for being here today," he said, his voice thick with fake tears. "You all know that the last few years of my life were incredibly dark and completely drained my spirit. I was chained to a past that offered me absolutely no future, and a partner who was entirely incapable of giving me the family I always dreamed of." He paused to wipe a non-existent tear from his cheek. A collective sympathetic murmur rose from the tables closest to the stage. Julian turned to Jessica and gently took her hand. "But then, I found Jessica." He continued, his voice vibrating with manufactured passion. "She stepped into my broken world, and she completely healed my shattered heart. She showed me unconditional love and gave me hope when I thought I was doomed to a hollow, empty life. With her, I'm finally stepping out of the darkness and into the beautiful, bright future we are going to build together." The elite crowd of wealthy church members and local politicians began to applaud to validate the tragic hero, but the applause died almost instantly as the guests nearest the front finally turned their heads and saw what had made Barbara drop her glass. The wave of suffocating silence reached the stage. Julian opened his eyes, expecting to see a room full of weeping, joyful faces. Instead, he saw 200 wealthy guests staring in absolute stunned horror at the center aisle. He followed their gaze, and his fake, tragic smile completely collapsed. I was standing exactly 10 feet away from the head table. The emerald green silk of my dress caught the light. I held my sleeping 8-month-old son, perfectly supported against my hip. I did not look like a toxic, broken woman. I looked like absolute reckoning. Julian went perfectly rigid as the silver microphone trembled in his hand. Jessica turned her head to see what was causing the terrible silence. When she saw me standing there, holding a baby, her face drained of all color. The beautiful, radiant bride transformed into a terrified ghost in less than a second. She took a clumsy step backward, and her lace heel caught on the stage. "What are you doing here?" Julian hissed into the microphone. His harsh, cruel tone boomed through the massive speakers, echoing across the silent tent. "You have absolutely no right to be here, Abby. Security needs to remove this woman immediately." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I walked right up to the edge of the elevated stage. The heavy leather diaper bag containing the legal binders bumped securely against my side. I looked up at the man who had abandoned me in a freezing clinic and demanded the sale of my childhood home. I looked at the woman who had manually altered my medical records late at night to convince me my body was broken. I felt my son breathing softly, right against my chest, and all my fear was now completely gone. Julian tells a very compelling story, I announced clearly into the quiet room. My voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it carried easily across the dead silent tent. I had spent years projecting my voice to classrooms full of teenagers, and I knew exactly how to command a room. The wealthy guests leaned forward in their expensive chairs. He talks beautifully about stepping out of the darkness. I continued keeping my gaze locked directly on Julian, but he left out the most important part of his miraculous recovery. He left out the part where he funded this entire lavish wedding with my life savings. A very loud collective gasp erupted from the tables. Julian turned a deep, violently angry shade of red. "Shut your mouth," he ordered, stepping toward the edge of the stage. "You are a bitter, unstable woman, and you are trespassing on private property." "I am not trespassing, Julian," I replied calmly. "I am simply auditing a fraudulent investment. You stood on this stage and told your friends you survived a broken, barren wife. You told your church community you escaped a woman who tried to ruin your life. But you forgot to mention that the luxury beachfront house you are standing in right now was purchased with $60,000 you stole from my checking account while we were still married." Jessica let out a sharp, panicked breath. She grabbed Julian by his right arm, desperately trying to pull him away from the microphone. He swatted her hand away with blind terror. He looked toward the back of the giant tent, searching for security guards. "Someone get her out of here!" He shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She is trying to ruin my reputation with absolute lies." I shifted Leo carefully to my other hip and reached into the deep pocket of my leather bag. "I am a public school teacher," I said calmly, and stepping up onto the first wooden stair of the stage. "I do not deal in any crazy lies. I deal in absolute and undeniable facts, and the facts of your miraculous healing are about to cost your beautiful new bride her medical license and send you directly to federal prison." The absolute silence in the massive reception tent felt heavy enough to crush stones. 200 of the wealthiest people in the city were staring at me, holding my 8-month-old son. I had just announced to the entire room that my life savings had funded the extravagant wedding they were currently attending. Julian stood on the elevated stage holding the silver microphone. His face had turned a sickening shade of gray. The charismatic, confident groom had completely vanished. In his place stood a terrified, cornered man who suddenly realized his carefully constructed lies were falling apart in front of his investors and friends. But Julian was too paralyzed by shock to speak. It was his mother who broke the suffocating quiet. Barbara pushed her chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed onto the marble dance floor. She did not care about the noise or the gasping guests around her. She marched down from the head table with her fists clenched tight at her sides. She wore a shimmering silver evening gown that caught the golden light from the chandeliers, but her face was twisted with pure, unadulterated malice. She stormed directly toward me, her high heels clicking aggressively against the pristine white runner carpet. She stopped just 2 feet away, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me into backing down. She glared at me, and then her furious eyes darted down to the baby resting against my hip. Leo was awake and looking around the bright room with wide, innocent eyes. He possessed his father's exact dark hair and unmistakable jawline. Barbara saw the undeniable physical resemblance, and it sent her into a complete panic. She knew the truth instantly, but her pride demanded she fight it. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "Get that bastard child out of here right now," she hissed, her voice vibrating with toxic rage. "How dare you bring your filthy mistakes into my son's wedding? Whose baby is that, Abby? You need to tell everyone the truth right now." I did not take a single step backward. I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I simply looked at the woman who had filed a false Child Protective Services report against me just to protect her cheating son. "You want the truth, Barbara?" I asked, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "I promised myself I would give you exactly that." I shifted Leo gently to my left hip, making sure he was comfortable and secure. Then I reached my right hand into the deep pocket of the leather diaper bag hanging from my shoulder. My fingers bypassed the baby bottles and the soft blankets. I grabbed the thick, heavy envelope that Thomas had prepared for me in his law office. I pulled out the crisp white laboratory report, bearing the official state seal and the strict chain of custody documentation. I walked right past Barbara, ignoring her completely, and stepped directly up to the head table. Julian took a clumsy step back, bumping into his own chair. I raised my hand and slapped the court-certified DNA. NA results down hard onto the expensive silk tablecloth right next to his untouched plate of wedding cake. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the wood echoed through the quiet room. That is exactly whose baby this is. I announced, projecting my voice clearly so the entire tent could hear every single syllable. He is yours, Barbara, and he is Julian's. A 99.9% mathematical match confirmed by the state court. I stared directly into Julian's terrified eyes. This is the exact same baby you stood on that stage and claimed I cheated to have. This is the healthy child I conceived naturally, while you were busy stealing my money and planning your escape. A massive collective gasp rolled through the crowd. Wealthy investors and church members began whispering frantically to each other. The narrative of the tragically infertile wife and the long-suffering husband was disintegrating right in front of them. Barbara stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. She stared at the bold black numbers printed on the laboratory report, and all the color drained completely from her face. She could not argue with science. She could not scream her way out of a court order. But the most dramatic reaction did not come from Julian or his mother. It came from the beautiful young bride standing on the stage. Jessica went completely pale. Her expensive designer gown suddenly looked like a ghost sheet draped over her trembling body. She knew exactly what that DNA test meant. If I was pregnant with Julian's biological child before the divorce, it meant her entire medical timeline was a proven lie. It meant the impossible hormone panel she had handed to my doctor was officially exposed as a deliberate forgery. The realization that she was about to lose her medical license and face federal prison time hit her with full force. Panic completely took over her mind. She lunged forward, her lace heels catching on the wooden stage, trying to grab the microphone from Julian's frozen hand. She wanted to call the security guards. She wanted to order the country club staff to drag me out of the tent before I could say another word. "Someone get her out of here!" Jessica screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Turn off the music and call the police right now." She reached for the microphone stand, but she never made it. A tall, imposing figure stepped out from the shadows near the service entrance. It was Thomas Wright, my attorney. He had followed me into the reception tent, quietly waiting in the back for the exact right moment to reveal himself. He wore a sharp, dark suit and carried his own heavy leather briefcase. He walked with the calm, predatory authority of a man who had destroyed countless liars in federal courtrooms. Thomas stepped smoothly between the stage and the head table, using his large frame to completely block Jessica's path. He did not touch her, but his presence was an absolute brick wall. "I would strongly advise against calling the police." "Miss Sterling," Thomas said, his deep voice carrying a chilling professional warning, "because I already have the local authorities on speed dial, and they are very eager to discuss the felony medical fraud indictment currently sitting inside my briefcase." He looked around the room, making eye contact with the wealthiest guests. "My client is not trespassing. She is delivering legally mandated discovery documents regarding an ongoing federal investigation into your new husband's grand larceny." Jessica stumbled backward, dropping her bouquet of white orchids onto the floor. The flowers scattered across the stage completely ruined. The entire reception tent descended into absolute pandemonium. 200 elite guests were now standing up out of their chairs demanding answers. Julian was sweating profusely, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence to defend himself. Barbara had sunk into a chair, clutching her chest in genuine shock. I stood tall in my emerald green dress, holding the sun they had tried to erase, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of pure justice. The audit had officially begun, and I was not going to stop until every single lie was exposed to the light. The suffocating silence in the reception tent was broken only by the sound of Jessica frantically trying to push past my attorney. But Thomas stood like a fortress, completely blocking her path. I turned my attention to the sea of wealthy guests seated at the tables draped in expensive white silk. Sitting at the table closest to the stage were Jessica's parents, Dr. William Sterling and Dr. Patricia Sterling. They had built their entire social standing on medical ethics and pristine reputations. They were staring at me with expressions of utter bewilderment, unable to comprehend why a woman holding an infant was accusing their daughter of a crime. I shifted Leo gently in my arms, feeling the warm rhythm of his breathing against my chest. I looked directly into Dr. William Sterling's eyes. I told him it was a true tragedy that his daughter had used her position at an elite fertility clinic to completely violate his legacy of medical integrity. The older man stiffened his face, flushing with defensive anger. He demanded to know what on earth I was talking about. He told me I was insane to barge into a wedding and insult his family. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into the heavy leather diaper bag hanging from my shoulder and pulled out the thick-bound report of digital server logs that Thomas had obtained through our massive discovery subpoena. I held the heavy stack of paper high up in the air for the entire room to see. I announced calmly that exactly 2 weeks after I had naturally conceived the healthy baby boy currently resting in my arms, my husband decided he wanted to leave our marriage, and Jessica had willingly provided him with the perfect, absolutely devastating excuse. A murmur of shock rippled rapidly through the elite crowd. I looked right at Jessica's parents and delivered the absolute truth. I explained that at exactly 11 o'clock at night, long after the clinic had closed, their daughter had manually bypassed the secure medical network. She had intentionally deleted my healthy blood work and permanently replaced it with the fraudulent hormone profile of a post-menopausal woman. She had committed a premeditated felony medical fraud specifically designed to convince a desperate, heartbroken wife that her body was permanently broken and completely incapable of bearing children. Dr. Patricia Sterling let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She covered her mouth with trembling hands. As a medical professional, she instantly understood the staggering severity of the accusation. She knew that altering a patient chart was not just a fireable workplace offense, it was a profound criminal violation that would immediately trigger federal investigations. I watched the arrogant pride completely drain from her husband's face. The pristine family reputation they had flaunted all evening was disintegrating into dust right in front of their wealthy friends. But I was not finished yet. I turned my gaze toward the center of the room where Julian's boss, the senior vice president of his corporate sales firm, was sitting with his wife. Julian had invited his entire executive team to witness his lavish new beginning. I walked slowly down the aisle toward their table. I announced that the medical fraud was only the foundation of their elaborate deception. Julian had not just used the fake infertility diagnosis to justify his cruel abandonment. He had used it to actively extort me in family court. I explained that Julian had aggressively demanded the immediate forced sale of my childhood home, claiming he needed to recoup $60,000 he had supposedly spent on my final fertility treatments. The executives at the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I told them that my forensic accountant had audited every single joint bank account we shared. The elite fertility clinic had never received a single dime of that massive sum. Instead, Julian had systematically embezzled my hard-earned teacher salary and the equity from my home to secretly fund a shell company owned by Jessica's brother. He had stolen $60,000 to put the massive down payment on the very luxury beachfront property where they were currently hosting this extravagant wedding reception. Julian let out a desperate strangled sound from the stage. He tried to deny it. He stammered that I was a bitter, jealous liar trying to ruin his big day with fabricated accounting errors. I did not even bother to look back at him. I reached into my leather bag one final time. I pulled out 4 separate, thick legal folders bound with bright red tape. They were the official court-certified copies of the comprehensive federal lawsuit Thomas had filed under a strict judicial seal. I walked directly up to the table where Jessica's parents were sitting in stunned silence. I dropped two of the heavy folders right onto their pristine white dinner plates. The solid thud of the paper hitting the porcelain echoed loudly. I told them they could read the raw data logs and the felony fraud indictments for themselves. Then, I walked over to the table where Julian's boss was sitting, his face twisted in absolute disgust. I dropped the remaining two folders in front of him. I told the senior vice president that his regional sales director had built his entire life on grand larceny and federal wire fraud. The entire reception tent erupted into absolute deafening chaos. Wealthy investors pushed their chairs back and stood up loudly demanding answers. Jessica's parents were frantically tearing open the legal folders, their faces turning gray as they read the undeniable digital proof of their daughter's crimes. Julian's boss threw his napkin onto the table in disgust and immediately pulled out his cell phone, his eyes glaring at the stage with cold corporate fury. I stood perfectly still in the center of the storm I had just created. I held my sleeping son close to my heart, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace as the truth finally set us both free. The heavy silence that had gripped the luxurious reception tent finally shattered, replaced by a deafening roar of overlapping voices. 200 wealthy guests were out of their seats, shouting, whispering, and pointing toward the elevated stage. The perfect, pristine facade of the coastal wedding had completely collapsed in a matter of seconds. I stood firmly in the center of the chaos, holding my son close to my chest. Leo remained surprisingly calm, lulled by the steady rhythm of my racing heart. I watched the absolute destruction of Julian's fake empire unfold exactly as I had planned, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of vindication wash through my veins. At the table closest to the stage, Dr. William Sterling and Dr. Patricia Sterling were frantically flipping through the thick legal binders I had dropped onto their plates. Their faces, previously glowing with aristocratic pride, were now drained of all color, resembling pale gray ash. As highly respected medical professionals, they understood the devastating reality of the digital server logs staring back at them. Patricia covered her mouth with a trembling hand, her eyes darting from the irrefutable evidence of felony medical fraud up to her daughter on the stage. William stood up his chair, scraping violently against the marble floor. He did not look angry. He looked entirely broken. He walked toward the edge of the stage, where Jessica was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her ruined bouquet of white orchids. Jessica reached out to him, crying for her father to fix it, begging him to call security. But William did not reach back. He looked at his beautiful daughter in her custom lace gown and shook his head slowly with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. He told her she was a disgrace to their family name and a disgrace to the medical oath she had sworn to uphold. Patricia joined him, unable to even look her daughter in the eye. Without saying another word, Jessica's parents turned their backs on their only child, linked their arms together, and walked straight out of the reception tent. They left their daughter sobbing on the stage, completely abandoning the wedding they had helped finance. The devastation did not stop there. A few tables away, Julian's boss, the senior vice president of the corporate sales firm, was absolutely furious. He had just read the forensic accounting spreadsheets detailing how Julian had embezzled $60,000 of marital assets to purchase the very beachfront property where they were currently standing. Julian, sweating profusely and realizing his career was imploding, jumped down from the stage and rushed over to his boss table. He held his hands up defensively, stammering out desperate, incoherent excuses. He claimed the numbers were manipulated, that it was a bitter misunderstanding, that he was simply going through a messy divorce. The senior vice president did not let him finish. He slammed his hand down hard on the table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle. His voice boomed over the chaotic noise of the tent, sharp and uncompromising. He told Julian that their firm handled millions of dollars in client investments and relied entirely on absolute corporate integrity. He looked Julian dead in the eye and stated that he flatly refused to employ a common thief and a fraud. Right there in front of dozens of important business partners and local politicians, he fired Julian on the spot. He told him to clear out his office desk by Monday morning, or he would have building security throw his belongings into the street. The executive then turned to his wife, offered her his arm, and they walked out of the tent, followed immediately by the entire corporate team. Julian was left standing alone on the pristine white runner carpet, his mouth opening and closing silently, watching his lucrative career vanish into thin air. Barbara, my former mother-in-law, was sitting in a chair clutching her chest. The smug superior woman who had publicly called me a delusional tramp in a corporate courtyard was now hyperventilating, completely unable to process the total ruin of her golden child. The conservative church members she had lied to for months were actively avoiding her gaze, picking up their coats, and quietly exiting the venue. The extravagant reception was rapidly emptying. Waiters and country club staff stood frozen near the service doors, unsure of what to do as the lavish party disintegrated. And then, cutting through the murmurs and the crying, came a sound that sealed their fate completely. The distant, unmistakable wail of police sirens drifted through the cool evening air, growing louder and more urgent with every passing second. Julian's head whipped toward the entrance of the tent, his eyes wide with sheer animal terror. Jessica stopped sobbing and froze her hands gripping the railing of the stage. The red and blue flashing lights reflected off the sheer white fabric of the tent, casting an eerie rhythmic glow over the ruined reception. My attorney, Thomas Wright, stepped forward from the shadows. He looked at the terrified couple and casually buttoned his suit jacket. He announced calmly that he had contacted the local authorities the moment we stepped onto the property, providing them with the unsealed federal indictments and the active arrest warrants signed by a judge earlier that afternoon. 3 uniformed police officers pushed through the double doors of the tent, their radios crackling in the sudden quiet. Thomas walked directly up to them, presented his legal credentials, and pointed straight at the stage. The officers moved with swift professional efficiency. 2 of them approached Jessica. They asked her to confirm her identity, and when she simply nodded, trembling violently, they informed her she was being placed under arrest for felony medical fraud and tampering with secure health records. They pulled her hands behind her back, the metal handcuffs clicking sharply against her delicate lace sleeves. The 3rd officer approached Julian. My ex-husband did not try to run or fight. All the fight had been completely drained out of him. He held his wrists out. His shoulders slumped in absolute defeat as the officer arrested him for grand larceny, wire fraud, and embezzlement of marital assets. I stood watching as the police marched the bride and groom down the center aisle of their own wedding. The guests who had remained were completely silent, recording the unbelievable spectacle on their cell phones. Julian walked past me, his head bowed, unable to meet my gaze. Jessica was weeping loudly, her designer gown dragging heavily against the floor. I held my son tightly, feeling the cool ocean breeze drift into the tent, washing away the toxic lies they had tried to bury me with. The immediate aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely just. The perpetrators were in handcuffs, the stolen empire was broken, and I had finally won. The weeks following that disastrous wedding reception moved with a breathtaking speed. Once the authorities stepped in and the federal indictments were officially unsealed, the entire foundation of their stolen life completely crumbled. 6 months have passed since that incredible night at the country club, and the justice that followed was absolute and relentless. Jessica did not just lose her lavish dream wedding. She lost the one thing she had spent her entire adult life working to achieve. The state medical board launched an immediate and aggressive investigation into her conduct at the fertility clinic. When Thomas presented the authenticated digital server logs showing her manually altering my patient files late at night, the board permanently revoked her medical license. But professional ruin was only the beginning. Because she had manipulated secure health records to facilitate a financial theft across state banking lines, she is currently facing severe federal fraud charges. She moved back into her parents' house in absolute disgrace, isolated from her former friends, waiting for a criminal trial that will likely end with her in a federal prison cell. As for Julian, the man who had confidently abandoned me in a freezing clinic room, found himself completely ruined by his own arrogant greed. Losing his lucrative corporate job in front of all his executives on the night of his wedding was merely the first domino to fall. Without his massive salary and facing an overwhelming mountain of legal defense fees, he quickly went completely broke. My attorney, Thomas, was absolutely merciless during the family court proceedings. He methodically presented the forensic accounting reports, proving Julian had embezzled my life savings and the equity from my childhood home to buy his seaside paradise. The family court judge was visibly disgusted by his actions. To avoid total civil ruin and immediate jail time for grand larceny, Julian was forced into a corner with absolutely no leverage. He signed a comprehensive settlement that surrendered his entire retirement account and transferred 100% of the equity in that luxury beach house directly to me. Furthermore, because of the documented medical fraud, his active participation in forging health records, and his complete abandonment during my high-risk pregnancy, the court stripped him of all legal and physical custody rights to Leo. He is now a disgraced, bankrupt man, living in a cheap, cramped rental apartment in the suburbs, completely erased from his son's life forever. And Barbara, the woman who had publicly called me a delusional tramp in a corporate courtyard and tried to use the government to steal my baby, finally faced the crushing consequences of her vicious pride. The conservative church community she had spent decades trying to impress turned their backs on her entirely. When the undeniable truth about the forged medical records and the stolen money became public knowledge across town, her wealthy friends abruptly stopped returning her phone calls. She was quietly but firmly asked to step down from all her prestigious committee positions. The women who used to hang on her every word now cross the street when they see her walking through the neighborhood. She spends her days sitting entirely alone in a quiet house, completely shunned by the society she worshipped, painfully aware that her golden child is a documented fraud and a complete failure. Today the air is warm and the late afternoon sun casts a beautiful golden glow over my front porch. I am sitting on the wooden steps of my childhood home, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind in the old oak trees. The fraudulent second mortgage that once threatened to leave me completely homeless has been entirely paid off using the funds I recovered from the prompt sale of Julian's beach house. My financial future is completely secure, and my teacher salary now goes toward building a solid college fund for my boy. I have a cup of hot tea in my hand, and I am watching my son play in the green grass of our front yard. Leo is a bright, happy, and incredibly healthy toddler now. He just learned how to walk on his own, and he spends his afternoons chasing butterflies and laughing at the world around him. I look at his sweet, innocent face, and I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash through my entire body. For so many years, I allowed a cruel, selfish man to dictate my worth. I allowed a corrupt medical coordinator to convince me that my body was broken, useless, and incapable of giving life. I injected myself with painful hormones and willingly drained my bank accounts because I thought love required endless silent sacrifice. I genuinely believed that if I just endured enough pain and asked for nothing in return, I would eventually be rewarded with a loyal family. But watching Leo stumble happily across the lawn, picking up fallen leaves, I finally understand what true family actually means. True motherhood and real partnership are not built on manipulation, financial extortion, or carefully constructed public images designed to impress strangers. They are built on absolute truth. They are built on the fierce, undeniable instinct to protect the people you love from the darkness of the world. Julian and Jessica tried their absolute hardest to rewrite my reality so they could steal my future. They wanted me to disappear quietly into the background, a tragic victim they could use to secure public sympathy. But they forgot one crucial detail. A mother fighting for the safety and future of her child will tear down heaven and earth to bring the truth into the light. I do not carry any bitterness in my heart anymore. Bitterness is a heavy, toxic burden, and my hands are completely full of wonderful things now. I have my son. I have my home. I have my dignity. I survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I did not just survive it. I exposed the villains, took back every single stolen dollar, and rebuilt my life entirely on my own terms. The broken woman who wept on the floor of a master bedroom while her husband packed his bags is gone forever. In her place is a woman who knows exactly how strong she is, and nobody will ever be able to take that strength away from her again. If you have ever had to stand up to someone who tried to rewrite your reality and break your spirit, type truth in the comments. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is. Until next time, remember they can try to bury you, but they do not know you are a seed.